When people are in acute despair or acute anxiety, holding something, being able to hold a tangible thing can be very meaningful. Well, I was working as a pastoral care worker in Queensland, and there I saw in the big base hospital that I was working in a beautiful idea where the crosses were given out to patients if the pastoral care worker felt that it was appropriate. When we moved to Adelaide, there didn't seem to be a source for cross making. And we devised the idea of a holding cross which could simply be held in the palm of the hand. When someone's acutely ill, sometimes just being able to touch something and being able to hold something with ease, it's light, and there's an incredible comfort for many people, and they'll clutch this. Or maybe they'll put it around their neck, or they'll kiss it, or they'll do something that shows that it's a symbol of great value and of great comfort to them. It's been a real learning experience for me. The cross was always part of my upbringing, and I always looked at it from a distance, basically, on the altar. And it was, of course, it had that strong meaning for me. But I think the whole idea of the cross is that it's that symbol of suffering. It wasn't unique to Jesus in the sense that he was stuck on that cross, because it was a common form of punishment for non-Roman citizens at the time, and thousands of people were crucified. But for Jesus, as God's Son, it wasn't just the physical agony, it was also the mental agony. And so it's a very powerful symbol of suffering. So God was prepared to enter into our human experience, to become one of us and to demean himself to that extent. That is pretty mind-blowing stuff. And so God understands what we're going through because he went through it on a much, much greater level. But then, again, you have on the other side of that incredible suffering the triumph of the resurrection that says, hey, there's a way out of this, and it's there for all of you because I love you all. No matter who you are or what you are, you're mine and you are loved. I really believe that it's a little nudge from the Spirit that says, it's okay, do it. I approach each patient prayerfully, and often just before I enter the patient's room, I just say, just help me through this, Lord, show me what you want me to do here. And sometimes I think, maybe this person would appreciate a cross, but I may well change my mind, or it may not be appropriate. So I do ask for a nudge from the Spirit, and it's very, very rarely that someone would say, no, thank you. It is a gift, we really stress that. It's a gift, you don't have to receive this if you don't want to, but would you like? And often when I tell people that it's come from a piece of recycled scrap or the old fence post, and look, this is what a clever man has been able to do with a piece of wood, and this is how God can transform our lives as well, even though they're messy or our relationships are in disarray. He loves you and he can transform your life as well. Sometimes the tears come, often the tears come, partly because it's a gift, I think, and because that symbol is presented to them in a way that they can touch And it's a very beautiful experience usually, the handing over of the cross. I suspect that it may well depend on their own theological background, where the cross isn't a symbol in all churches. I think through some traditions it wasn't okay to even have crosses, even though they are Christian. So it depends a little bit on people's belief system as well. And the symbolism of the cross doesn't always mean the same thing, to actually have one in that sense.
Timber is a natural thing, and that's one of the big things. It's not plastic or metal. It's a naturally grown product, and there's a warmth to it, and people warm to wood. So that was one thing. Because I'm a carpenter, I have a little bit of a conscience about the number of trees that I've used in my 40 years of building. And I've really got onto the recycling cycle, and it's true that it did start off with old fence rails and things like that, but I discovered to my joy that there is a lot of timber that can be used, but even when timber looks like it's ready to be thrown out, and it's gnarled and cracked on the outside, to my surprise, if you cut that timber down to the size of a cross, in the heart of that piece of timber that's gnarly on the outside, you still there is a strip of beautiful, clean timber. And for me, there's a theological thought there that when our bodies can be so riddled with sickness or whatever it is, deep inside of that piece of wood, as in us, Christ is looking at our heart, not at the warts and everything in our body. I see that as a very powerful part of this whole ministry. In the creating of the cross, I am making this thing to somebody who can appreciate that when they are so sick that this cross, this little piece of timber, has come from something that could have well been burnt and thrown out, but it's been saved, and that's the beauty of this and the motivating thing for me. So I love it. I think it had to be very user-friendly. You can hold it in any position of your hand, but it had to be no sharp corners like the traditional cross, and smoothed and round, and that's how it came about. Not partly by accident, but partly through thought and Kay's discussing with Kay what patients, how they can handle things. It can be arthritic, and you can still actually handle it. So I think that's how it came about. Well, the thong came about because, particularly in the hospitals, patients are actually allowed to wear this under their gown. And again, that goes over their head. But Kay has told me that people hang it up from their hospital hook, where they, it's quite visible. But it's just something else that they can actually use it as something below their gowns. And I have known people to wear it concealed, but it's always there. There's something they can hold on to. So any bigger, and it would become probably a little bit cumbersome, but it's certainly meeting the need. We did, at one stage, I did think about dressing it up a little bit, but we soon steered away from that because we didn't want it to be worn as fine jewellery or something to enhance the person. We wanted something that had a deeper meaning to it. So there is plainness to it, but there's wonderful beauty. You look at the grain, you can imagine just lying in a bed and just looking at the different grains and the curls in it. And as you look into that, it's like looking deep into yourself as well, you know. So it's plain, but it's beautiful.
And I would add that in the simplicity of it, I think there's a powerful message in simplicity.
Yes.
It's not complicated to come to God because God's right there, and all you have to do is ask. There are no strings, there are no complications. You simply have to open your heart and ask Him in. It's as simple as that.
When I finally sand these crosses, I have a personal prayer over each cross. And I don't know where this cross is going, to who it's going. But I believe that my Lord and Saviour does know, and that the prayer that I pray over, that this cross is going to meet the need of that person. And sometimes I'm praying in English, and sometimes I'll go into tongues, because when you're making 20 or 30 crosses, it's a bit hard to keep the same English going all the time. But I've found it a wonderful blessing to be able to perhaps start in English and finish in a tongue, a language that I don't really understand, but from my heart and my spirit is in it, and I know that gift that I've been given, I can pass on too. I don't think there would be one cross that is exactly the same as the other. Each one is personally sanded the way I feel and the way the grain is going, and so that makes it a unique thing too. It's not, while it is production, it is not exact reproductions at all. Each one is individual. And that's the way I like doing it. It becomes a very personal gift to somebody down the track. So when I finally lace it with this lacing leather, it's ready to go out. Its production is finished, and it's ready to serve the Lord in whatever capacity Kay and the other pastoral workers find it.
I think initially our role as pastoral carers across, it covers every patient in the hospital. So we would have people from other faiths, we would have atheists, we have agnostics. So our role as pastoral carers really is to present a ministry of presence, just being totally present to that person. We are there in a non-judgmental way. In a sense, I'm the conduit. I love that, the old conduit idea of, I grew up on a farm where there were the electricity wires ran through this piping, and that incredible power that was hidden by the outside conduiting that ran up the wall. But that's how I see it. It's simply a channel for God's grace, and who of us knows where people are at, even though they, at this point in their lives, they may have rejected God. There is still very often a God voice there, and a faith in God even. So it's my role to try to empower them to get in touch with who they are, who they really are, and where God is in all of that. So it's a very humbling experience when people do allow you into their sacred space. One of my mentors in my training years, I had expressed that frustration about, you make this sometimes very wonderful contact with a person in their faith journey, and you have one go and that's it, no follow-up, no nothing. And she said, you must remember you are only one very small link in the chain of their journey, And this is where God has placed you at this moment in time, and this is your role now. But you have to be prepared to let them move on. So it is very much that presence for who knows for how long, and then their journey goes on. And it's all in God's hands, not mine. We both grew up in very privileged to be part of a faith journey. There were times in my life when I could have very easily rejected it. I'm sure Ian probably was too.
Oh, yeah.
During my years at university, there was so much else out there. And I've always loved ideas, and I've delved fairly deeply into all sorts of other people's ideas. But as we look back on our lives, I think we see more and more the pattern that has emerged about how God was there, particularly in the tough times when we thought he wasn't. But for all of that, part of being human means that there are going to be things that go wrong. And I think more than anything that incredible power of God's guidance was there. And I see it much better now than I perhaps did 20 years ago.
Yeah. I think in all the years that I've lived, it's now in retrospect where I can see God, where there were times when I really questioned and when I was angry with him because I was not getting anywhere with it. But now I am deeply grateful that those tough times like when I nearly went broke in business, and part of that going broke was my fault because I was ignorant and my ego was getting in the way of things. But we came through that, and now that lesson was a good lesson for me because I learnt from it. But there was a time when it's strange that you don't seem to get an answer from him. It seems you're given the strength to go through it. And when something goes bad, it doesn't necessarily get good. You've got to live through that bad period, but your heart still beats and you still get sufficient sleep to keep on going. And then it takes a turn, and that's now I see it so clearly. And I'm very grateful for those experiences. And Jesus is there, God is there, and the Spirit is working. In in some cases, I think he's too much of a gentleman. He just sits back too far when I'd like him to be a bit up front. But the power is there, and it's in his timing. And yeah.
I had a lady some years ago who had come from the north. She had been basically incarcerated for many weeks in hospital and had reached rehab stage, which was a promising thing for her. She had come from a traditional faith, but as an immigrant during the war and post-war trauma, I think that she'd lost her connection with her faith journey. And those weeks of solitude and isolation from her family had given her a lot of time to think. And during our conversation, it was one of those occasions when I did feel moved to offer her the cross. And she accepted it very, very graciously. And just before she was to be discharged, she requested another visit, and she said, I really would love to have, I think it was 8 more of these crosses for my family. And she offered to pay, which of course we refused, but she insisted on giving us this beautiful distilled orange oil that Ian now uses to actually coat the crosses. It was a very, very special gift that she bestowed on us. But I gather that from that experience, not only herself, but she was really anxious to revive, or perhaps, yes, to resurrect some faith in her family, in her children as well. So I think it was a reconnection to the faith that she'd had probably 50 or 60 years before. It was a reminder. And again, in her isolation and in her loneliness, I believe that the Spirit was prompting her to reconnect. This cross also does impact on staff, and not only in the sense that staff will often ask us to visit patients because they feel that there is a spiritual aspect to their care that needs to be addressed, because sometimes the clinical by itself just doesn't work. But this nurse actually came to me and she asked me for another cross. She had a little boy who was autistic and very perturbed and very upset, particularly at night time when it came to going to sleep. And he had, she had taken a cross home and he had latched onto it, and he, for whatever the reason, he had put it under his pillow and he refused to be parted from that cross at night time. It was part of his settling and part of his going to sleep. Other nurses have asked if they can send one to their mums, or particularly if they're international nurses. They've gone overseas to parents who were believers. Maybe the nurse wasn't, but she knew that her mother would love to have one of these. So it's been popped into the mail a couple of times. That's happened. So. I continually have to revisit trying to understand suffering, because it is so in your face. But I just believe that somehow through suffering, God can transform us if we'll just allow Him in. And through incredible suffering, incredible things can happen. So even though it's bad at the time, no, you can't glamorise it, but in some way, when God walks through it with you, or when you allow God to walk through it with you, just be open to what can happen.
Nobody wants to suffer. It's like nobody wants to be poor. It's one of these things in our human life, but it comes. And I think when we suffer, Jesus is suffering with us, and that is one of the gem of the Christian faith, is to know that Jesus is there with us.
When I think about the cross, I guess I do think of the suffering. It is a symbol of extreme suffering. I believe too that the currency of any suffering, the currency of love, is suffering. As parents, we know that even. You know, we all understand that to a limited degree in our own lives. But what that must have meant for God, who was prepared to put His own Son on that cross, is just incredible. So it's that symbol of suffering, but of course there's so much more. The empty cross, it's the triumph of the cross. And I suppose things looked pretty bad on Good Friday. In fact, it seemed to be the end of an incredible dream. And yet there was that incredible triumph of Jesus' resurrection. And that's the promise, and that's the faith and the hope that we have, that even though things are rotten when you're at this stage, the God of hope is still there, and He carries us through, and He has triumphed. And there's so much more waiting for us. So much more that we can't even begin to imagine.
No.